Great. Good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you. This is my second time doing this Torah study. I joined you all for Parashat Shoftim just a few months ago, and we had a conversation about kingship and whether or not it's an obligation for the Jewish people to install a king based on some verses we looked at in Deuteronomy and a debate between rabbis in the Talmud afterward. Today we're going to be looking at the main narrative that takes place. Main as in because it takes up the most space in our Parsha this week, Chayei Sarah, and that's the narrative of Abraham's servant, who is not named in our Parsha, but I'm going to assume is Eliezer, just for the sake of saying Eliezer and not Abraham's servant every time. So it's Eliezer's journey to find a wife for Abraham's son, for Yitzchak. And it's one very long chapter, this 24th chapter of the book of Genesis that we're going to be focusing on. And we're only gonna really look at a few sections, but I'll just make a few introductory remarks about what I sort of want to investigate, look at today. And it's going to be, for the next 40 minutes, pretty interactive. I am most interested in the course of this conversation in hearing what you have to say and getting some thoughts, because this story of Eliezer going to find a wife for Yitzchak is essentially told twice. It's told once in Abraham's directions to Eliezer, and then the narration of Eliezer's journey back to Haran, back to Abraham's homeland, to find a wife. And then it comes again once Eliezer goes into the house of Bethuel, of Rivka's father. Eliezer then tells the story again of how he got where he got. And so I want to focus on a few questions. I'm going to type them out in the chat too, so that we have them. The first question is, what is Abraham looking for in a wife for Isaac? I guess you could say, what is he looking for in a wife for himself? Because he does get married again at the end of our Parsha, but that's a story that we're not going to do today. So that's one. What is Abraham looking for? And then question number two is, why does he have the specific criteria that he has? Right. So we're going to look at the verses, not someone from Canaan. We're gonna go into that, but those are some of the questions that I wanna talk about. Not just what are the specific things that he wants, but also why does he make those specific requests in giving Eliezer instructions. Before we go in, David, do you have a question?
Comment.
Yeah.
He realizes he's aging. He's lost Sarah, and he feels a big responsibility to make sure that Yitzchak has a mate. I think it's my answer to your question. Why is he doing it at this time? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Right, so there's also the question on top of that of why don't we get these instructions earlier? Why don't we get them before Sarah dies? Obviously, we're still not that far off or far away from the Akedah, from the binding of Isaac. So yeah, I think also a good question to keep in mind here is why exactly now in our narrative? I think it's another good thing to consider. Thank you for all of your comments. I'm going to try my best to I'll just read out a couple of things people have mentioned. Right, so we have a relative from his father's family. So that's that's an interesting question about the relative from his specific family. We're gonna get into. I know why you're saying that, and I also it's we'll get to it, but it's an interesting question of whether Abraham really wants it to be from his family. But we'll get there. Okay, and then a lot of you are saying values that we're going to see aren't necessarily said explicitly by Abraham, but I think what some of you are inferring, Phyllis and Warren and Fury and Ayala, that we've seen specific qualities that Abraham shows, Hachnasat Orchim, welcoming the guests, things like that, and so yeah, so it would be natural for him to want those qualities in a daughter-in-law. Okay, and a lot about, some of you have said, keeping the lineage. That's another interesting thing with Eliezer, that Abraham throughout our story has a lot of anxiety around lineage. That earlier in the Torah gets manifested in the way that Abraham thinks Eliezer, the servant who he's now talking to, maybe Eliezer is going to be that descendant. But let's go. I'm going to share my screen. Let's go into our verses. And first, we're going to look at. Actually, before I share my screen, just because I can see all of you now, and I won't be able to do so easily in a few minutes, could I have a volunteer to read in the English, just while I can see more of you, some of the verses we're going to look at. Yes, Cantor Mark, great. So just, and then Ellen, you're on deck. Okay. How we did, everyone? Can we see? All good? Okay, perfect. Take it away.
Abraham was now old, advanced in years, and Adonai had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to the senior servant of his household, who had charge of all that he owned, "Put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by Adonai, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but will go to the land of my birth and get a wife for my son Isaac." And the servant said to him, "What if the woman does not consent to follow me to this land? Shall I," you got to scroll up because it's blocked here. "Shall I then take your son back to the land from which you came?" Abraham answered him, "On no account must you take my son back there."
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna, this here, it might be easier for you to actually raise your hand using the button in addition to in real life. I'm gonna try and see as many of you as possible, but just get some brief reactions in addition to the sort of simple, what is Abraham looking for, not Canaanite, etc., etc. What do you think is and some of you have already answered this question in the chat in the last few minutes, but what are your initial reactions to Abraham's request here? Tanya, we'll start with you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to have my hand up.
Oh, no worries. No worries. Okay, Janet.
Okay, I'm a little like, well, I shouldn't say confused, but like I have a question. Like he wants Isaac's wife to be from the land where he came from, yet he doesn't want Isaac to have to go back there if the woman doesn't want to come to where they are now. And so that seems to be like he has some kind of contradiction in himself or questioning in himself, that he knows what kind of lineage he wants, but he wants that lineage to be brought over to where he is now. And I'd like to know why, or are we going to find out soon?
So I think that's a great question to hold on to, because we're gonna. I don't know if we're gonna get you a great, solid solution, but I hope that the sources over the course of the next half an hour or so will at least give you some options to think, some ways to think about that question. But I think it's a great question to start with. Thank you, Janet. Ginger.
Why? What was the reason for the Eliezer to put his hand on Abraham's thigh?
Yeah, it was a way in the ancient world of it's sort of in the same way that we put our hand on a Bible when we make an oath. it was a way of taking something seriously. That's just how they did oaths back then. But it's for sure strange. But that's the significance. Yeah, simcha.
I'm going to get mystic and attempt to answer your question. And what I think the seeking in what I read in this, I tend to make metaphor and symbology of all the things, but the seeking is, I always think of like a woman who's able to hold in a way that's really earthly as well as spirited. I think of breath, I think of heaven and earth, I think of air, I think of like being a vessel, and to go like just lost wife and then to go to the land of birth to find the partner just feels like a no beginning, no end. Like how can we restart and rebirth this from a place of mourning, from a place of loss? Something new and beautiful that feels familiar and completely new, to be able to heal and grow a new family. And that's the end of my word vomit in my attempt to answer your question. Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. And I think I like the way in which you picked up on some of the specific language, because what we're going to do in a few minutes when we look at Eliezer's recounting of some of this is notice what he does, what he omits, what he adds. What he maybe, is he using a synonym for something, or is he changing something? All live questions. So I think you're picking up on those specific things is going to be important. I'm happy.
I don't have the specific language to kind of represent the theme that I sense is happening here. But I feel like at this incredibly bereft moment when Abraham loses Sarah, he's wanting to move forward with new generations that carry forward Sarah's attributes. And perhaps Eliezer, because he's a servant and not a son, has a gift of a little more objectivity.
Interesting. Yeah, I think this is another question. I didn't ask it explicitly, but I think is why doesn't Abraham go himself? He seems to have a lot of specific requests. Why doesn't Abraham go himself back to the land? What's the significance of Eliezer? And I think something that I'll just front with that my teacher, Rabbi Richmond, taught last week and has taught about is that Eliezer really has a central role in the story here. Not just the story of the sort of finding a wife, on a small scale. It's not small, but on that scale. But also in carrying on the lineage that God has promised. So I think that's important to remember. Let's just take these last 3 comments and then we'll move on. First on the iPhone, and then David and then Cantor.
Well, it seems his request seems reasonable to me. He has already separated himself from his brothers and his father. He wants somebody who will have the same lineage as he, who's not praying to foreign gods. He doesn't want to. One of his firm promises to Sarah was that he would make sure that Isaac received the inheritance. If Isaac went to Haran or wherever and didn't come back, then Ishmael may show up to claim his inheritance. So it seems to me that for the laws of the land at that time, his behavior and his requests are quite reasonable.
Great, thank you. David.
Oh, I don't know. I'm the least common denominator on this group, so I apologize. But kind of looking at the language, so he wanted to go to the land of Abraham's birth. There's an assumption there that the the wife that will be found there has the same values, if you will, and the same inner being that that he had as he remembers the land. How does he know that things have not changed dramatically back there? And then at the end, he's saying, he's almost stating that as saying, on no account must you take my son back there. So he wants to find a woman from that lineage, but there's no guarantee that, maybe the lineage is obviously genetic, but things may have changed significantly, and that seems to be what he may be referring to on the last sentence here. So it's a little confusing to me.
Yeah, I think those are great questions. I'll just point out two things. One is we've been talking about his family as in terms of what he wants, but he hasn't yet said family. He says land, and it's the same language that was used when he left back in the 12th chapter of Genesis. So, you were all saying family for the right reasons because of what's coming next. But let's just notice that, number one. And number two is, I just referenced his having left in the 12th chapter. Why did he leave? From what we know, according to the rabbinic tradition, he left because they were idolaters, right? And here you could assume that he doesn't want Yitzchak to marry one of the daughters of the Canaanites because the Canaanites are idolaters. So I think, David, to get to your question, maybe he's relying on things having changed, because if things haven't changed, why does he prefer a Haranite idolater to a Canaanite idolater? So that's all sitting there. Cancer mark, and then we'll move to some more verses.
So just a surface thought, he's asking the future wife to make a similar journey to what Abraham and Sarah made, to leave her home, to leave her family into the unknown. And I think that's a value that might be inherent in this.
That is not surface level at all. I think it's a beautiful point, and there are a lot of people who've written. There's a lot there, but Rabbi Judith Hauptman and Judy Klitzner, people have written about Rivka being the true inheritor of Abraham, exactly for the point you're making, because she makes, just like Abraham, she's left lach.
And similarly, that Isaac should not go backwards. Right. That the whole family, the whole tribe goes forward on this path that they set out on. Yeah.
Right. Beautiful. Tanya, if I could ask you to hang on to your point just for a few more minutes. I want to move to a few more verses, and then we'll come back. Okay. Let's see. Someone had their hand up before to read, but I don't remember who it was.
It was Ellen.
Ellen, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. Let's. We're actually. I'm going to make an executive decision here. We're going to skip the second part, and we're going to go straight to the retelling. So just to fill in a few blanks, Eliezer goes back to Haran. Rivka shows up at the well after Eliezer prays for her to show up, essentially. Rivka gives water to Eliezer and his camels before her own. And so Eliezer says, this is the one. Finds out that she's indeed a relative of Abraham. Rivka's father, Bethuel, is Abraham's nephew. And then back in Bethuel's house, along with Lavan, Rivka's brother, we get a retelling of the story. So if you could start here from Now My Master. This is tale number 2.
Now my master made me swear, saying, you shall not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites in whose land I dwell, but you shall go to my father's house, to my kindred, and get a wife for my son. And I said to my master, what if the woman does not follow me? He replied to me, Adonai, whose ways I have followed, will send me a messenger with you and make your errand successful, and you will get a wife for my son from my kindred, from my father's home, my father's house.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now I think some of you now may have realized why I was careful not to say father's home during round one. But Tanya, we'll start with you. But I'm curious for people, either thoughts that are left over from the first section or what you see in comparison here between, and I'm sorry that the screen isn't big enough to have both of them side by side, but what you notice here in Eliezer's retelling that's different from the account of Abraham and then from the account of Abraham earlier in the chapter.
Well, the only comment I was going to make is so far as him leaving to get a relative, it's not uncommon in Middle Eastern culture today to marry relatives. So I think that was also part of the culture of that time.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it shows up even more strongly here when Eliezer says from or reports Abraham having said, from my father's house. Okay. Any comments here on? Thank you, Tanya. Any comments on distinctions between telling number one and telling number two? Yeah, Marcia. You're muted. Marcia, you're still muted.
Is this Marsha Shirts?
Yeah.
I didn't have a comment.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I thought I saw here.
Accident.
Okay. David.
The difference here is in the second reading, he is guaranteed to find a mate. Whereas in the first reading, it was doubtful because he said, what if I don't find one? And here he's told, don't worry about it. You will find a mate. That's my take on it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just, Greta, we'll get to in just a second, but what I'll ask either for David to follow up or for someone else is, do you think it's meaningful that in the first story, we get a report, we get the report that you're talking about, he doesn't know whether he's going to find, and then he doesn't say that when he's talking to Rivka's family. I'll try not to be too leading there, but if anyone wants to take that, you're welcome to. Greta, please.
It seems in the second telling that the covenant's being emphasized or underlined here. I have followed in the ways, so fingers crossed, good things should come of that.
Definitely. And I also, this gets to Simcha, what you were sharing earlier. You referenced heaven and earth as having been central to Abraham, or, the God of heaven and earth as central to Abraham's sort of promise of what's going to happen here. And here we don't, I want to see if I can see you in the text, right? We don't get the language of Shemayim va'aretz. We don't get the language of heaven and earth. One option here is Nechama Leibovitz, a famous biblical commentator, says that Eliezer omits those specific that specific language of heaven and earth because Eliezer knows that Betuel and Rivka and this family in Haran are idolaters, and it would have been very strange for them to have heard God of heaven and earth. right? Essentially, Eliezer is talking to a specific audience here, and so he omits that. Jay.
So I notice in this particular part of the portion, Abram refers to God being with him on this journey, or at least having a messenger from God with him, which will make things successful. So it's a belief in God being with him.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you. Simcha.
Yeah, thank you for articulating that earlier, because as you said that, I really like how you said the ritual was to put like hand on thigh, that's like skin on skin, and then to use the voice. What I see here is really intentional language of like conviction. Like I was listening to something at some point, or some Torah group or whatever, and what I heard was, you know, God said, let there be a light, and then there was like, there's power in word, like it's intentional, it's deep in faith, to take out all of the maybe kind of like maybe like all of the fluff language, and to be really direct has us, it's using our breath and using ourselves to actually believe it, and then walk that way to have it happen.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Franna.
I read yesterday in another group that this entire speech that Eliezer gives to the family is a very diplomatic speech. And he does a little flattery, he does a little exaggeration. He really wants to make sure that they're okay with him taking this wonderful woman back to Isaac, because he thinks she's the perfect one.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely, unfortunately, we're only looking at a small snippet.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. And I think, and I'll try and, we're going to touch on this towards, I guess we're already towards the end. We'll touch on it a little bit closer to the end, that Eliezer knows what he's doing here. And all of these, part of why I was interested in looking at this is that, there are a lot of ways of dealing with this situation where you have essentially two tellings of the same story, and you have omissions and you have additions and all these things. And one way is to say, okay, that's just like literary, this is how we tell stories. We use a synonym, things like that. But I think in this, especially in this specific case, I think that, it's not just two tellings of the same story, it's two settings, right? The first setting is a private conversation between Abraham and Eliezer, and then Eliezer's private journey to Haran. And here, Eliezer has an audience that he has to deal with. And so it doesn't make sense for Eliezer to use the same language, that Abraham had used with him before. And I think we do this all the time. We change words, we omit things in telling people, what we heard, and we add here and we embellish. One of the first things Eliezer says is how wealthy Abraham is, right? So, and he's not really embellishing. Abraham is very wealthy, but he's going to make a shidduch. Like he's gonna embellish those things. He's gonna make a match for Isaac. So I think it's great. It's important here to look, especially at not just, okay, we have differences between version 1 and version 2, but also there are reasons for that. There are specific reasons for that. Tanya.
In the first telling, Abraham didn't say my father's house.
Yeah, definitely. That's exactly where I wanted to go. So thank you for raising it, because a lot of people said, talked about father's house back in the first telling. So I'm curious, either Tanya, for you or for someone else, why do you think? So just to clarify, version 1, Abraham uses the word moladati, which is generally translated as the place of my birth, right? And then here he specifically says, Eliezer says in retelling Abraham, my father's house, right? That's what we've got. Why do you think either to Tanya or to someone else, why do you think?
I think maybe he was sweetening them up. You know, he was flattering them in the sense that you all have been chosen by this very, very rich man to marry his very, very rich son.
Yeah. He wants them to feel. Abraham didn't just say, go back to Haran and like find whoever you want to find. Abraham, you know, in telling this to Rivka's family, Abraham said you, right? Exactly. It's a choice. Abraham said you. Happy, was your hand up? And I see, so that the chat wasn't working when I was in screen share, which is why I'm back here. So I'm scanning through some of your comments, and I know some of you have also picked up on this father's house piece, but Happy, please.
My hand is not supposed to be up. I apologize.
Sorry. Leslie.
Well, I think Eliezer has a very important function and assignment. So when he already finds out that Rebecca is the family, then when he repeats it, he wants to make sure that he doesn't get a no for an answer from the family. So he emphasizes the family relationship.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Just to peek into the chat, Jen says Abraham didn't want to limit Eliezer on which houses to go to. I think that makes a ton of sense. That in telling it, he sort of says, we're going to try and cast as wide a net as possible. And then when Eliezer gets to the well, finds out what's happening, then he can, exactly as some of us have said, then he can say, I chose you specifically. Let's see. Jay, Abraham's faith in God is clear in this version. His faith convinces him this will be a successful mission, right? So this is part of what I was getting to earlier. That we saw this sort of hesitance, the doubt that Eliezer had about his mission in telling number one, and that isn't here. And so some commentators say, well, it's not here because, as some of us have said, Eliezer is being very diplomatic. He's trying to use everything he can to make sure that he gets the answer that he wants. And it wouldn't look good for him to say, oh, by the way, I had all these doubts about whether or not this would work and you would come with me. Because then Rivka's family would say, well, why the reason for doubt? Right? What aren't you telling us that's giving you reason for doubt? So I think that there's a lot of richness in here. Any other, I'm gonna scroll a little bit through the chat, but any other comments on either on differences in general or on the specific piece about Abraham not specifying father's house necessarily in version number 1, and then Eliezer saying that in number 2. Just take a second to see if anyone else wants to share. Okay. Carol, I see your hand. You're muted.
Sorry, which Carol?
Carol Katz.
There are
Hello.
actually 4 Carols, believe it or not.
Okay. Thank you. Because originally, in the original instructions, to bring a wife from the land of his birth, as you said, casting away a wide net. But then in the retelling, when Eliezer says from the family, that narrows the possibilities, that limits the number of possible candidates, and it really makes the task so much more difficult. to accomplish. So I'm wondering why Eliezer put that limitation on his mission.
Yeah. So Abraham was the first one to put the limitation on, and then I think what we're seeing from Eliezer here in part 2 is once he's found the right one, he no longer needs to report a limitation. Right now that he's essentially everything is worked out the way he wants it to, he's in the right place. Now he can sort of say, no, this was meant to be you.
Mm-hmm.
Simcha, and then we're gonna move ahead. Yeah.
I'm gonna get over my internal dialect of taking over, because when I have a question, the second telling, I mean, it's after the fact, right? So like when I think of how messages come and guidance come, it's like, go home, go to the place of birth. Great. No, go directly to your house. You know, like the answer is so simple. Like in a place of mourning, in a place of like not knowing what to do and creating solution, it's given a really like, you must go home to the land where you were born. And it's like, oh, here's a specific house. Like it feels like more, I see a plant or a seed growing of like recreating family, legacy, and then it gets more specific as time goes on. So it just feels like re-meaning intention and getting really specific in what's here and what the guidance is. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we're gonna go back to the source sheet here. So just to tell you a little bit about how our commentators deal with the question that we're dealing with here on the distinction between back to the place of my birth and back to my father's house. Rashbam, Rashi's grandson, says that essentially there's no problem here. Essentially, moladati, place of my birth, is a synonym. Essentially, Abraham told Eliezer specifically father's house. He just used slightly different language. So that's one way of getting around it. I don't know how satisfied I am, which is why I wanted to hear from you before we went there. And then he sort of doubles down on it later on when Eliezer says, you know, if this isn't right for you, I'll leave. I'll go to the right or to the left. But he's not right or to the left means other family members. So there's certainly a way of getting around this without sort of. What I don't like about that, I think, is that it doesn't open up for us the possibilities of sort of analyzing why we would have the distinction. But that's certainly an approach. And if you were feeling that, you have good company. I'll also just point out briefly earlier in the story when Eliezer first meets Rivka and finds out. I'm not going to read the verses inside here, but first finds out that Rivka is indeed a relative. He seems a little surprised, right? He doesn't, right? He asks who this woman is. And then when he finds out, he bows down and says a prayer. And I think one potential reading of that is to say, you know, he's happy he found a relative, but he didn't necessarily expect it to happen. We're gonna look at one final source that I think is, hopefully will sort of drive home for us a little bit of what exactly this journey of Eliezer is. So this source comes from Bereshit Rabbah, which is a late collection of midrashim, not so late, but a collection of midrashim of stories about Bereshit, about the book of Genesis. And we have this statement. I'm only going to read the beginning of it. He says, Rabbi Acha says, more beautiful is the conversation of the patriarch's servants than the law of the patriarch's descendants, right? And he derives this from a verse. If anyone's interested, the verse is at the bottom of the source sheet. We're not going to look at it inside, but essentially, we know the law about the impurity of the flesh of a creeping thing on the ground, and we're able to derive that its blood is also impure from a very specific technicality of one letter, right? And so we get a big law in the course of one letter in the entire Torah. But here in our story with Eliezer, we get, an entire chapter's worth. We get 2 tellings of essentially the same story. And I want to sort of end here by suggesting that, he says, more beautiful is the conversation of the patriarch's servants than the law of the descendants, which I think is interesting to think about on its own as an idea. What I sort of see happening here, at least in the story of Eliezer, is it's not just that Eliezer's conversation, Eliezer's telling of the story to Rivka's family in version 2, it's not just that it's more important than the law of the descendants, it's that it essentially enables the law of the descendants. It enables the descendants in general. Eliezer's mission here is to carry on the lineage of Abraham through Yitzchak. And as some of us have said, a lot of people have said it in different ways, Eliezer is being very, very intentional, being very diplomatic in his conversation, in his attempt here to, I'm just on my share, in his attempt to make sure that he gets a yes and he's able to bring Rivka back to Isaac. And I think his conversation is more important because he has to use his words very carefully, right? And it's Eliezer here who sort of propels our story ahead. It's his conversation that not only is it more important than the law of the descendants, which we don't get so much in Genesis, but if I'm back later on in Leviticus or later, we can talk about law. But essentially, we don't get that law. There is no law to be had if it's not for the specific conversation, the specific words here, not just of a patriarch, but of a patriarch's servant. So we're going to end there. I hope we can all appreciate Eliezer's journey and the many words that he brings to us as we go into Shabbat, and we only saw part of the 2 tellings, but hopefully this leads you to want to look more inside, because there are plenty of more omissions and additions that I didn't get to. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for sharing and participating, and Shabbat Shalom.